Imagine a boy born on a rugged Mediterranean island who would one day shake the very foundations of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte's story doesn't begin in the gilded halls of Paris or the grand palaces of Versailles, but in the modest streets of Ajaccio, Corsica, in 1769. The world he entered was one of uncertainty and change. Corsica had just been sold to France by Genoa, and the islanders, fiercely proud and independent, were still adjusting to their new rulers. In this environment, young Napoleon learned early about identity, pride, and the struggle for recognition. His family, the Bonapartes, were of minor nobility, respected but not wealthy. His father, Carlo, was ambitious, seeking opportunities for his children in the new French administration, while his mother, Letizia, was a pillar of strength, guiding her large family through hardship and hope. From the beginning, Napoleon was different. He was serious, intense, and fiercely intelligent. He devoured books, especially those about history and war. He admired the great conquerors, Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal, and dreamed of glory beyond the narrow confines of his island home. But life in Corsica was not easy. The Bonapartes were outsiders in their own land, caught between the old Corsican ways and the new French order. Napoleon's early years were marked by a sense of not quite belonging, of always having to prove himself. This feeling would follow him throughout his life, fueling his ambition and shaping his destiny. At the age of 9, Napoleon's father secured him a place at a school in mainland France. It was a world away from Corsica, both literally and culturally. The young boy spoke little French, and what he did speak was heavily accented. He was mocked by his classmates, who saw him as a foreigner, a provincial. But Napoleon was not easily discouraged. He threw himself into his studies, determined to excel. He learned French quickly, though he never lost his accent, and he began to distinguish himself, especially in mathematics and history. He was solitary, preferring books to people, and he developed a reputation for being both brilliant and aloof. After a brief stint at a school in Autun, Napoleon was admitted to the military academy at Brienne-le-Château. Here, the challenges intensified. The curriculum was demanding, and the social environment was even more so. Napoleon was still the outsider, still the subject of ridicule, but he responded not with anger, but with focus. He became a master of self-control, learning to hide his emotions and project an air of confidence. He studied the great battles of history, analyzing tactics and strategies, and began to dream of his own campaigns. His teachers recognized his talent, and some predicted that he was destined for greatness. In 1784, at just 15, Napoleon was accepted into the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. This was the final step in his formal education, and he completed the program in just 1 year, a remarkable achievement, especially given the financial difficulties his family faced after his father's death. At 16, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery, beginning a military career that would soon change the course of history. But the France that Napoleon entered as a young officer was a nation on the brink. The old order was crumbling, and the winds of revolution were beginning to blow. The monarchy was losing its grip, the people were restless, and the future was uncertain. For a young man of ambition and talent, it was both a time of danger and a time of opportunity. Napoleon watched as the revolution unfolded, first with caution, then with growing interest. He saw the possibilities for advancement, for a new kind of meritocracy, where talent, not birth, could determine one's fate. As the revolution gathered pace, Napoleon's career began to accelerate. He was in the right place at the right time, and he had the right skills. His expertise in artillery, his ability to think quickly and act decisively, set him apart from his peers. He was given command of troops, and he proved himself in battle, showing a flair for leadership and a willingness to take risks. His rise was not without setbacks. He was briefly imprisoned during the political purges of the revolution, but he always managed to land on his feet, often stronger than before. By his early 20s, Napoleon Bonaparte had already begun to make a name for himself. He was ambitious, driven, and supremely confident. He believed in his own destiny, and he was determined to seize every opportunity that came his way. The world was changing, and Napoleon was ready to change with it. He was no longer the outsider, the provincial boy from Corsica. He was a rising star in the new France, a man with a vision and the will to make it real. As the revolution entered its most turbulent phase, Napoleon's talents became increasingly valuable. He was called upon to suppress uprisings, to defend the republic against its enemies, both foreign and domestic. He did so with skill and ruthlessness, earning both admiration and fear. His reputation grew, and with it, his influence. He was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming a symbol of the new France, a France that valued talent, energy, and ambition above all else. By the time he was 26 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte was poised on the edge of greatness. He had overcome poverty, prejudice, and the chaos of revolution. He had proven himself in battle and in politics. He was ready for the next step, the leap from promising young officer to legend. The stage was set, and the world was about to witness the rise of a man who would reshape history. The year was 1796, and France was at war with much of Europe. The revolution had unleashed forces that could not be contained, and the old monarchies of the continent were determined to crush the new republic. In this crucible of conflict, Napoleon Bonaparte was given his first major command, the Army of Italy. It was a force in name only, poorly equipped, poorly fed, and demoralized by years of defeat. But Napoleon saw not a burden, but an opportunity. He arrived in Italy with a sense of purpose and a vision for what could be achieved. He spoke to his troops not as a distant commander, but as one of them, promising glory, honor, and the spoils of victory. His words electrified the army, and his presence inspired confidence. For many, it was the first time they believed they could win. Napoleon's Italian campaign would become the stuff of legend. He moved with speed and decisiveness, outmaneuvering larger and better supplied Austrian forces. He understood the terrain, the psychology of his enemies, and the morale of his own men. He used surprise, deception, and audacity as his weapons, striking where he was least expected and never giving his opponents time to recover. In his series of brilliant battles, Montenotte, Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli, he shattered the Austrian armies and forced them to the negotiating table. The victories were not just military triumphs, they were political earthquakes. Napoleon's name became known across Europe, and his legend began to grow. But the Italian campaign was more than just a series of battles. It was a test of leadership, of vision, and of the ability to turn adversity into advantage. He reorganized the conquered territories, setting up sister republics and spreading the ideals of the French Revolution. He negotiated treaties, collected tribute, and sent vast sums of money and art back to France. He was not just a general, he was a statesman, a builder, and a symbol of a new era. The old order trembled at his approach, and the people of Italy, long oppressed by foreign rulers, saw in him a chance for change. Yet for all his success, Napoleon was never content. He was restless, always looking for the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove himself. In 1798, he set his sights on Egypt, a land of ancient mystery and strategic importance. The campaign was bold, even audacious. Napoleon hoped to strike at British interests in the East to open a new front in the struggle for global supremacy. He landed in Egypt with a large army and a team of scientists and scholars, determined not just to conquer, but to discover. The Egyptian campaign was a mixture of triumph and disaster. Napoleon won a stunning victory at the Battle of the Pyramids, defeating the Mamluk cavalry and capturing Cairo. He sought to present himself as a liberator, respecting local customs and traditions, and even proclaiming his admiration for Islam. But the campaign soon ran into trouble.
The British Navy under Admiral Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, cutting Napoleon off from France. The army faced disease, desertion, and constant attacks from local forces. The dream of an Eastern empire began to fade. Despite these setbacks, Napoleon's time in Egypt was not wasted. He oversaw archaeological discoveries, including the Rosetta Stone, and his scholars laid the foundations for modern Egyptology. He also demonstrated his ability to adapt, to improvise, and to maintain the loyalty of his men in the harshest conditions. When the situation became untenable, Napoleon made the difficult decision to return to France, leaving his army behind but carrying with him the lessons of both victory and defeat. Back in France, the political situation was chaotic. The revolution had devoured many of its own, and the government was weak and divided. The people were weary of war, instability, and economic hardship. And into this vacuum stepped Napoleon, the hero of Italy and Egypt, the man who seemed to embody the hopes and dreams of a nation. He moved quickly and decisively, forging alliances, outmaneuvering rivals, and presenting himself as the savior of France. In November 1799, he staged a coup d'état, overthrowing the government and establishing himself as first consul. It was a masterstroke of political theater, and it marked the beginning of a new era. As first consul, Napoleon set about consolidating his power. He reformed the administration, stabilized the economy, and brought order to a country exhausted by years of turmoil. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, a system of laws that would become the foundation of modern legal systems across Europe. He made peace with the Catholic Church, ending years of religious conflict. He negotiated treaties with France's enemies, bringing a temporary respite from war. For many, it seemed as if France had finally found the strong, stable leadership it so desperately needed. But Napoleon was not content to be merely a ruler. He saw himself as the architect of a new world, a world in which talent and merit would triumph over birth and privilege. He surrounded himself with capable advisors, promoted officers based on ability rather than aristocratic connections, and encouraged innovation in every field. He believed in the power of ideas, in the possibility of progress, and in the destiny of France to lead Europe into a new age. Yet as he built, Napoleon was always aware of the fragility of his position. He knew that his power rested on his ability to deliver results, to win victories, and to inspire loyalty. He was constantly vigilant, always looking for threats, always planning his next move. His energy was boundless, his ambition limitless. He worked long hours, demanded much from those around him, and tolerated no dissent. He was both admired and feared, loved and hated, a man who inspired intense loyalty and deep suspicion. As the new century dawned, Napoleon's star was in the ascendant. He had risen from obscurity to become the most powerful man in France and perhaps in all of Europe. But the challenges he faced were immense. The old monarchies had not forgotten their defeat, and new coalitions were forming to oppose him. The fate of France and of Napoleon himself hung in the balance. The stage was set for the next act in the extraordinary drama of his life.
The world watched as Napoleon Bonaparte transformed from first consul to emperor, a metamorphosis that would forever alter the course of European history. In 1804, after a series of political maneuvers and a carefully orchestrated referendum, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in a lavish ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral. The symbolism was unmistakable. Here was a man who owed his rise not to ancient bloodlines, but to his own genius and the will of the people. Yet, as he placed the crown upon his own head, Napoleon sent a clear message to the world. He was the master of his own destiny, beholden to no one. With the imperial title came new responsibilities and new challenges. Europe's monarchs, alarmed by the rise of a self-made emperor, formed new coalitions to contain the French juggernaut. Napoleon, undeterred, set about consolidating his power at home and expanding his influence abroad. He reformed the French administration, modernized the economy, and continued to promote the ideals of merit and efficiency. His court was a blend of old aristocracy and new talent, a reflection of the society he sought to create, a society where ability, not ancestry, determined one's place. But it was on the battlefield that Napoleon's genius shone brightest. His campaigns during the early years of the empire are still studied in military academies around the world. In 1805, facing a formidable alliance of Britain, Austria, and Russia, Napoleon led his Grande Armée across Europe with breathtaking speed and precision. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Austerlitz, often regarded as his greatest victory. Outnumbered and facing two of Europe's most powerful armies, Napoleon used deception, maneuver, and timing to devastating effect. The result was a crushing defeat for the Allies and the collapse of the Third Coalition. Austerlitz was more than a military triumph. It was a demonstration of Napoleon's ability to inspire and lead. His soldiers adored him, not just for his victories, but for his willingness to share their hardships, to reward their bravery, and to remember their names. He was a master of motivation, using words and gestures to forge a bond of loyalty that would carry his armies across continents. Yet, for all his charisma, Napoleon was also a hard taskmaster, demanding discipline, courage, and absolute obedience. The years that followed saw a series of campaigns that extended French influence from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. Napoleon redrew the map of Europe, creating new kingdoms and installing his relatives and loyalists on thrones. He sought to spread the principles of the revolution: equality before the law, religious tolerance, and the abolition of feudal privileges across the continent. In many places, these reforms were welcomed, bringing an end to centuries of oppression and stagnation. But in others, they provoked resistance, as local elites and traditionalists fought to preserve their power. Napoleon's ambitions were not limited to Europe. He dreamed of a global empire, one that would rival the ancient Romans. He sent expeditions to the Caribbean, sought alliances in the Middle East, and even contemplated an invasion of Britain. But not all his ventures succeeded. The disastrous campaign in Haiti, where French forces were decimated by disease and fierce resistance, marked the end of his colonial ambitions in the Americas. The sale of Louisiana to the United States in 1803, while providing much-needed funds, was a tacit admission that some dreams were beyond reach. At home, Napoleon continued to consolidate his rule. He established a network of spies and informers, censored the press, and suppressed dissent. While he promoted merit and efficiency, he also demanded loyalty and conformity. His regime was both progressive and authoritarian, a paradox that would define his legacy. The Napoleonic Code, his most enduring achievement, brought order and rationality to French law, but it also reinforced patriarchal authority and limited certain freedoms. Napoleon saw himself as a modernizer, but he was also a man of his time, shaped by the contradictions of the age. As the empire reached its zenith, cracks began to appear. The continental system, Napoleon's attempt to blockade Britain and destroy its economy, proved difficult to enforce and damaging to French interests. Smuggling flourished, and many of France's allies resented the economic hardship imposed by the policy. Meanwhile, the constant demands of war strained the resources of the empire and the patience of its people. Conscription, taxes, and the loss of life took their toll, and murmurs of discontent grew louder. Yet for a time, it seemed as if nothing could stop Napoleon. His armies marched from victory to victory, and his influence extended into every corner of Europe. He was courted by kings and feared by emperors. His image appeared on coins, statues, and paintings, a living symbol of power and ambition. He married Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian emperor, cementing his place among Europe's royal families. The birth of his son, the King of Rome, seemed to guarantee the continuation of his dynasty. But beneath the surface, the forces of opposition were gathering. Nationalism, awakened by Napoleon's conquests, began to stir in Spain, Germany, and Russia. The old monarchies, humbled but not defeated, plotted their revenge. And within France itself, the burdens of empire were becoming harder to bear. Napoleon, ever the strategist, sensed the dangers but believed in his ability to overcome them. He trusted in his genius, his luck, and the loyalty of his soldiers. He had defied the odds before, and he was determined to do so again. But the challenges he now faced were greater than any he had encountered. The next chapter of his story would test not just his skill as a general, but his judgment as a ruler and his resilience as a man. The turning point in Napoleon's extraordinary journey came with his decision to invade Russia in 1812, a campaign that would become synonymous with both his ambition and his downfall. The seeds of this fateful choice were sown in the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined early 19th century Europe. Despite his marriage to Marie-Louise and his efforts to integrate France with the old monarchies, Napoleon's dominance was resented and feared. Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, had grown increasingly resistant to the continental system, and the fragile alliance between the two powers began to unravel. Napoleon, ever confident in his own abilities, believed that a decisive victory would restore his authority and secure his empire for generations to come. The scale of the invasion was unprecedented. Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée, a force of over 600,000 men drawn from across his empire and its allies. It was the largest army Europe had ever seen, a testament to his organizational genius and the reach of his power. Yet from the outset, the campaign was fraught with difficulties. The vast distances, the harsh climate, and the logistical challenges of supplying such a massive force all conspired against him. The Russians, refusing to give battle, retreated steadily, employing scorched earth tactics that left the French with little to sustain themselves. Towns and villages were burned, crops destroyed, and the land itself became an enemy. When the two armies finally met at Borodino, the battle was fierce and bloody, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. Napoleon entered Moscow expecting a surrender, but instead found a city abandoned and set ablaze. The victory was hollow, and as the harsh Russian winter set in, the Grande Armée began its long, agonizing retreat. Starvation, disease, and relentless attacks by Russian forces decimated the once mighty army. Of the hundreds of thousands who had marched into Russia, only a fraction returned. The disaster shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and emboldened his enemies across Europe. The Russian campaign marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. The losses were irreplaceable, and the aura of invincibility that had surrounded him was gone. Across the continent, old foes and new allies joined forces in a renewed coalition. Prussia, Austria, Britain, and Russia united in a common cause, determined to drive the French from their lands and restore the old order. Napoleon, undaunted, rallied his remaining forces and fought a series of desperate battles in Germany. At Leipzig, in the so-called Battle of Nations, he suffered a crushing defeat, and the tide of war turned irrevocably against him. Back in France, the situation grew increasingly dire. The economy was in ruins, the people were weary of war, and political support for Napoleon began to erode. His once loyal marshals and ministers grew restive, sensing the end was near. In 1814, as Allied armies closed in on Paris, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The man who had once ruled most of Europe was exiled to the tiny island of Elba off the coast of Italy. It seemed as if the story was over, the final chapter written. But Napoleon was not a man to accept defeat easily. Less than a year after his exile, he escaped from Elba and returned to France in a daring gamble that stunned the world. As he marched north, soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined his cause, and the people rallied to his banner. The king fled, and Napoleon entered Paris in triumph, beginning what would become known as the 100 Days. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the old magic had returned, as if the emperor might once again defy the odds and reclaim his throne. Yet the coalition powers were determined not to repeat their earlier mistakes. They mobilized their armies and prepared for a final confrontation. The stage was set for the Battle of Waterloo, a name that would become synonymous with both glory and disaster. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced the combined forces of Britain under the Duke of Wellington and Prussia, led by Blücher.
The battle was fierce and closely contested, with moments when victory seemed within Napoleon's grasp. But a series of miscalculations, the late arrival of Prussian reinforcements, and the exhaustion of his troops sealed his fate. By evening, the French army was in retreat, and Napoleon's reign was over. After Waterloo, there was no escape. Napoleon surrendered to the British, hoping for leniency, but instead was sent into exile once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. Isolated, watched by guards, and cut off from the world, he spent his final years reflecting on his life, his achievements, and his failures. He dictated his memoirs, sought to shape his legacy, and maintained a small circle of loyal followers. The man who had once commanded millions was now a prisoner, his empire reduced to memories and dreams. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon's presence loomed large. News of his exile and his final days fascinated Europe and the world. Rumors and legends grew, and his image became a symbol of both the dangers and the possibilities of ambition. He died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, far from the land he had once ruled. His last words reportedly invoked France, the army, and his beloved Josephine, a poignant reminder of the passions that had driven him all his life. The fall of Napoleon was not just the end of a man, but the end of an era. The old monarchies were restored, the map of Europe was redrawn, and the world entered a new age of conservatism and reaction. Yet the ideas and reforms that Napoleon had championed could not be so easily erased. The legacy of his rule, both the triumphs and the tragedies, would continue to shape the course of history for generations to come.
Long after Napoleon Bonaparte's death on the windswept island of St. Helena, his shadow continued to stretch across Europe and the world. The man who had risen from obscurity to command empires left behind a legacy that was as complex as it was profound. For some, he was a tyrant, a warmonger, whose ambition plunged the continent into years of bloodshed. For others, he was a visionary, a reformer who swept away the old order and laid the foundations for the modern world. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, shaped by the contradictions and complexities of a life lived on the grandest of stages. Napoleon's most enduring legacy is perhaps the Napoleonic Code, the system of laws he introduced in France and exported across much of Europe. Before Napoleon, laws were a patchwork of feudal customs, royal edicts, and local traditions, often arbitrary and unjust. The code brought clarity, consistency, and a measure of equality before the law. It abolished feudal privileges, protected property rights, and established the principle that all citizens were equal in the eyes of the law. While it was not perfect, women's rights, for example, were sharply limited, it represented a giant leap forward from the chaos and inequality of the past. Even today, the legal systems of many countries bear the imprint of Napoleon's reforms. But Napoleon's influence extended far beyond the law. He reformed education, creating a system of lycees and universities designed to train the administrators, engineers, and officers of the future. He modernized the French economy, built roads and bridges, and encouraged scientific and technological innovation. He promoted religious tolerance, made peace with the Catholic Church, and opened the doors of government to talent from all backgrounds. In many ways, he was a child of the Enlightenment, believing in reason, progress, and the power of human will to shape destiny. Yet, for all his achievements, Napoleon's legacy is also marked by war and suffering. The Napoleonic Wars claimed millions of lives, devastated cities and countryside, and left deep scars across the continent. His relentless pursuit of power, his refusal to accept limits, and his willingness to sacrifice so much for the sake of glory have led many to see him as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition. The very qualities that made him great, his energy, his vision, his belief in his own destiny, were also the seeds of his downfall. Still, the impact of Napoleon's rule cannot be measured solely in terms of victories and defeats. He changed the way people thought about government, society, and themselves. He showed that talent and merit could triumph over birth and privilege, that a single individual could shape the course of history. He inspired generations of leaders, soldiers, and dreamers, from Simón Bolívar in South America to Abraham Lincoln in the United States. His life became a template for the modern hero, flawed, ambitious, and larger than life. In France, Napoleon's memory has always been a source of fascination and debate. His tomb at Les Invalides in Paris is a place of pilgrimage, visited by millions who come to pay their respects or simply to marvel at the story of a man who rose so high and fell so far. His image has been used by monarchists and republicans, by revolutionaries and reactionaries, each seeking to claim a piece of his legacy. Statues, paintings, and books have kept his memory alive, and his name remains synonymous with both greatness and controversy. Beyond France, the world Napoleon left behind was forever changed. The old monarchies were restored after his fall, but they could not turn back the clock. The ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity that had swept across Europe during the Revolution and the Empire could not be erased. Nationalism, awakened by Napoleon's conquests, would become one of the driving forces of the 19th and 20th centuries, shaping the destinies of nations from Germany to Italy to Greece. The map of Europe, redrawn by Napoleon's armies, would continue to shift and change as people sought to assert their own identities and destinies. Napoleon's story is also a story of myth and memory. Over the years, he has been portrayed as everything from a romantic hero to a ruthless dictator. Writers, artists, and filmmakers have returned again and again to his life, seeking to understand what made him tick, what drove him to such heights, and what brought him down. His own memoirs, written in exile, sought to shape his image for posterity, casting himself as a misunderstood genius, a man ahead of his time. The reality, as always, is more complicated, a blend of brilliance and blindness, of vision and vanity. Perhaps what makes Napoleon's story so compelling is its very human quality. He was not born to greatness, he seized it. He made mistakes, suffered defeats, and faced moments of doubt and despair. Yet he never gave up, never stopped believing in his own destiny. His life is a testament to the power of ambition, the importance of resilience, and the enduring allure of the dreamer who dares to reach for the stars. In the end, Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of history's most enigmatic and influential figures. His rise and fall are a reminder of the possibilities and perils of power, of the ways in which individuals can shape the world and be shaped by it in turn. His legacy lives on not just in the laws and institutions he created, but in the imagination of all those who seek to understand the forces that drive history. Whether seen as a hero or a villain, a genius or a madman, Napoleon's story continues to captivate, to challenge, and to inspire